The new podcast, In the Shadow of Princeton, starts as the matriarch of a prominent Princeton family is found stabbed to death in her locked basement. Investigators look from a serial attacker to her family to Princeton University students. One hot-blooded investigator sees a conspiracy. Is he way off base, or does privilege let you get away with murder? In the Shadow of Princeton is available wherever you get podcasts, or you can binge it ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, everyone. I'm Therese Bottomley, editor of the Oregonian and OregonLive. This is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I'm talking to Maxine Bernstein, longtime police and courts reporter here at the Oregonian OregonLive. Max recently covered an extraordinary trial in Southern Oregon, which we'll be talking about today. Max, welcome back to Beat Check.
Thanks for having me, Therese.
So, tell me about this trial. I mean, this was a longer than usual trial for Oregon. It was in federal court. It was out of Klamath Falls. So, what was it all about?
It was about two alleged kidnappings of women, one from Seattle, Washington, and one from Klamath Falls. One man, Negasi Zuberi, was accused of kidnapping both women separately within 2 months of each other in 2023, taking one woman across state lines and driving her some 450 miles to a home in Klamath Falls where he lived and sexually assaulting her on the way and locking her in a cinder block cell in the garage of his home. After that case, after the FBI was involved in that case, they learned another woman. Both women were 21 years old, but the second woman had been reported that she had been abducted from outside a bar in Klamath Falls, and Zuberi had taken her to the garage of his home as well and repeatedly sexually assaulted her. So this was a 2-week trial in federal court in Medford for kidnapping, and there was also allegations that he possessed guns and ammunition.
So the extraordinary part here, this guy had built a jail cell in his garage. I mean, there was video of him at like a Home Depot or something with cinder blocks. So he kidnaps this woman, he brings her to the garage, and what does she see essentially?
So she said that he forced her to put a sweatshirt over her head with the hood covering her face as he backed into the garage of his home, and then led her out of this Honda Pilot SUV that he was driving and walked her into this tiny little room that was bare bones, concrete floor. It had a single bare light bulb hanging, one wooden chair in the cell, and he made up this ruse that he was an undercover officer and that he'd been watching her for a long time. She was a commercial sex worker. He had picked her up in Seattle and actually paid her $100 for sex in the back of his car along an alleyway in Seattle, and then claimed that he was an undercover officer. He had been watching her for some time and that he was taking her to a processing center. And she's watching where he's taking him, and he's getting onto the freeway southbound, and she's asking, wait, where are we going? This doesn't make sense. And he's he's just telling her to be quiet and that he went a little too far and he's got to take her to this processing center. It'll be some time, and they're getting to Tacoma. He finally pulls off the side of the freeway at one point, and there she's handcuffed, and her ankles are bound with leg irons, and he sexually assaults her there. And then once they get to, she sees his phone at one point with a Google map, and she sees it's about 2 hours the destination away. So she has no idea where he's taking her. And then ultimately leads her to this small room in the garage of his home, and it's extremely hot, and he still has this story that he's got to talk to others, and he'll bring her a uniform, and they'll get processed, and this is sort of the transition center. She doesn't know what's going on. She's just extremely warm in this single cinder block cell with there's insulation. It's very hot. She's asking him, could you please bring me water? Can you lower the temperature? He ultimately brings her some water, and then he leaves, and he at one point comes back and hands her, this is through her testimony at trial, hands her a handwritten paper, and he asks her to fill it out, and it has questions such as her name or social security number, whether she's had any vaccinations or sexually transmitted diseases, and she doesn't know what to think at that point, but she's very frightened.
Wow. So this thing was clearly very premeditated. I mean, he had the handcuffs, the shackles. He'd already built this cell. I mean, this was not a spur of the moment kidnapping. So unbeknownst to her, she's really in a house in a neighborhood, right? I mean, who else is in the house, and what kind of neighborhood is it?
So this is a residential neighborhood in Klamath Falls, and interestingly, the house that Zuberi was renting is owned by the Klamath Falls mayor, Carol Westfall, and he had rented the home since February 1st of 2023. The sexual assaults and kidnapping occurred of this woman in mid-July of 2023. The mayor was among the witnesses called to testify at trial. She said she had listed the home on Craigslist, and that this Mr. Zuberi was one of 3 or 4 candidates that she considered. She basically Googled to see that his property management company that he said he worked for existed. She found it on the internet, and she rented the home to him for $2,000 a month. She was she had the understanding that it was he and his 2 young children, 2 sons, but she did not know that the mother of the children was also living there with him, and she also did not know and said she hadn't permitted it, but he was subletting the house to at least 2 other roommates.
So conceivably, there are other people who are just not noticing this cinder block cell in the garage as they go about their day. I mean, it's really strange. And then how long was she kept in there? And tell the story of how she got out.
Yeah, so they had, just to the initial point they had some of the roommates called as witnesses at trial, and they said they would come in either the main door, they never went to the garage, and they didn't hear anything unusual, or they were working and they were out of the house a lot. So they all said they were unaware of anything unusual. Now, the Washington woman, she arrived at the home. It was about dawn on July 15th. She was picked up July 14th, like late at night. She gets in there. She said she fell asleep for about an hour or 2 because she hadn't slept all night during the drive. And then when she awakened, she looked around and she realized she panicked. And she started yelling and screaming for help, but the walls were heavily insulated. So she laid down on the floor and wondered if she would yell and maybe her voice could be heard under the door, but she heard an echo, so she realized her voice wasn't getting out. So she had long acrylic nails. She testified. She said she bit the nails down so she could form a fist and punch out the metal screen door. That there were no doorknobs. It was locked. So she first tried to kick the door, but it wouldn't move. So she started just pounding on the screen of the door, and she was able to knock the mesh off the screen door, which opened up. There was a rectangular slit that she checked if she could fit through. She first put her head through it sideways, and she could get her head through. So she came back. I think he had left her some sweatpants. She was wearing a black bodysuit. She put on the sweatpants, and then she squeezed. She was 120 pounds. She squeezed through this really narrow slit in this metal door. And then once she got past that, there was this other wooden door, and she just banged it and beat on it, and it came off its hinge and got past that. And then she remembered he had shown her a firearm on the drive from Seattle. So she saw that she was in a garage then, and his vehicle was there. So she went around to the driver's side, opened the driver's door, and found the gun near the driver's floorboard, grabbed the gun, and found this small door on that was not the main garage door, but it was a small door, and busted out of there. And then she had a fence to go through in the front of the house. It's a residential home, and it was probably around noontime and on I think it was a Saturday, and she was barefoot. She jumped over the fence and she ran into the street just screaming and yelling for help. And there happened to be a woman who was driving up. It was North El Dorado Avenue in Klamath Falls about that time, and she testified. She was from Depot Bay. She was in Klamath Falls because her husband was attending a Comic-Con event, and she was on her way to this Comic-Con, and she was dressed up as Rosie the Riveter, and she sees this woman screaming and yelling and almost like coming in through her open driver's side window of her car, and she stops, and the woman said she'd been raped, kidnapped, and she got in. The victim got into the back seat of her car, and she just drove to a nearby KFC and called 911.
Wow, it's truly amazing. And when that victim testified, did you get a sense of how she was and how she was doing since?
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by how, her testimony at least came across as very measured and calm and strong, and she didn't break down in tears. So I'm clear she's lived through this for a long time, and I'm sure she was interviewed multiple times by federal agents.
But still, she also, a 20-year-old, that this happened to, it's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, she had to point him out. She had to, point who did this to her, and he's watching all this testimony. He's right there, and she, raised her hand and pointed to Mr. Zuberi.
So she was the second victim, as you mentioned. So the first victim, and he was convicted in that case as well. But talk about that. I mean, she was traumatized. She wasn't sure what to do. And then when she did decide to contact police, it didn't end up with a good result.
Yes, that was interesting. That so as police were investigating the Washington woman's kidnapping and assault, they learned that a local woman from Klamath Falls 2 months earlier, in May of 2023, had reported that she was abducted and sexually assaulted. She said she was outside a very popular Irish pub in downtown Klamath Falls, the Pikey, on May 6th after Cinco de Mayo celebration. She was 21. She had gotten off work. She went to friends to the bar, and then early she didn't. One of her friends had left. She didn't have a ride, and Zuberi approached her outside the bar. She testified, and she doesn't recall getting into his car, but she does remember suddenly she's in the passenger seat of his vehicle and he's speeding off, and she's telling him to slow down. What are you doing? He slows down and she tries to jump out of his Honda Pilot. He finally pulls over to a side of the road in a rural area outside the city and goes around to the passenger side, opens it up, and tases her and hits her in the ribs and handcuffs her and puts cuffs around her ankles and puts her in the back seat and tells her, this is all through her testimony, says that, if she would have cooperated, he wouldn't have had to do this. And then he drives to his home. And back, he also, the same thing, she testified that he put a sweatshirt over her face before he pulled into his garage, and then in the back seat of his Honda Pilot, sexually assaulted her multiple times. She was abducted for about 13 hours. She was trying to, tell him anything that would maybe get his sympathy to let her go. Finally, she said that her dog was sick and she needed to give her dog Duke medication, and he seemed to respond somehow. But also at that time, it was interestingly the mayor's son, who usually picked up the rent from him at the home, said he had texted Mr. Zuberi that very day about 11:30 or so, while this woman was still in his car in his garage, saying if he could come by around 1 to pick up the rent. And Zuberi texted back that, sorry, he hadn't slept well that night. Could you come a little later at 4? And then Zuberi ultimately drove this woman out, stopped at a Chase Bank where he withdrew hundreds of dollars in cash and then gave her $300. She said she didn't want to take anything from him, but ultimately she took it, and then he dropped her off near her home. And she was frightened. She didn't know what to do. She called a friend of hers that night, and she also had the friend take her to the hospital.
And that's when police were notified?
Well, not so at the hospital, her first time that night, she was waiting for hours to be seen, and she got frustrated, so she left. And then the next day, she made up a story to her friends. She was ashamed by what occurred, and so she claimed that a long-lost friend had beat her up. And she didn't mention that she'd been sexually assaulted. She went to this friend's family's home that night, and there was a sister and a mom, and she also reported the same story, but they were concerned about her injuries and had her go back to the hospital the next day. She was seen. She told the doctor a similar story about how she was beaten up, didn't reveal that she'd been sexually assaulted. And then 3 days after she was abducted, she called Klamath Falls police, and an officer came out to interview her in her backyard. She gave the whole story, the whole said she was sexually assaulted repeatedly, and she said the officer didn't seem interested, took a report. She offered to provide the clothes she was wearing the day of the assault and kidnapping, and she hadn't washed them. She offered to provide like a sketch she made of Zuberi, and the officer didn't take either, said she'd get back to her the next day. She'd never heard back, and she said she had to call Klamath Falls 3 or 4 more times before another officer got in contact with her and just said they'd alert her if there were any developments.
And then there really weren't until they put it together with the other case. And so this is, you hear about sexual assault victims being reluctant to come forward and feeling like they aren't taken seriously. And it sounds like she definitely felt like they weren't taking her story seriously until this second incident. They were investigating that. So they had a lot of evidence. The prosecutors had these 2 women testify. They had they had videos of him shopping for cinder blocks and some list of potential targets or something. I mean, they had a lot of evidence, and then the defense really didn't have much to put on.
That's correct. The prosecutors described it as a dump truck of evidence. They had a mountain of evidence, and they brought it out over 2 weeks of trial. They had his cell phone GPS pings, which enabled them to track his location to Reno, Nevada, where he was arrested just a couple days after the Washington woman escaped from his home. Actually, the next day, they found him in Reno, Nevada. They tracked his iCloud account, and they found he had, searched for flights from Reno to New York and Reno to Turkey. They did a search warrant on the garage of the home, and they found the whole cinder block cell. They found handcuffs. The Washington woman's purse was in his garage. They went through his master bedroom, and they found handwritten notes about, one was titled Operation Takeover. Another had a list of women under the heading Targets. They found also on his iCloud account a cell phone video he had taken. The woman from Klamath Falls said he, at one point while he's forcing her to have sex with him, made what he called an insurance video, or a blackmail video, claiming that, she was enjoying what was going on and that he planned to show it if she told anyone. They found his Home Depot receipts and video surveillance images that showed him wheeling, tons of cinder blocks out of the Home Depot. Amazon purchases for cell phone jammers. They searched a trailer he owned where they found the taser, several firearms, handcuffs, and other evidence. So the defense argument was that the prosecutors were making a federal case out of something much smaller, and argued that the government was presenting all this evidence that really didn't pertain to the charges that he was facing. They also claimed that the sex was consensual and the women's accounts didn't didn't track with the evidence. They didn't present any witnesses. They didn't call any witnesses. All the defense did was play this so-called insurance video for the jury.
But then at the end, there was a bit of a twist, like after closing arguments?
Yeah, it was very unusual. So before closings, before the defense rested, the judge, U.S. District Judge Michael McShane, had a colloquy, a conversation with Zuberi and his lawyers to make sure he understood his right to testify. But if he didn't testify, the jury would be instructed not to draw any conclusions from that as well. And this is out of the presence of the jury, and Zuberi said he decided not to testify. And then the defense rested, and the prosecution started with opening their closing argument on Friday morning after 2 weeks of evidence. And the prosecution finished their closing, and then it was usually the turn of the defense to start their closing. But one of Zuberi's lawyers, Amy Potter, stood up and said Mr. Zuberi had changed his mind and wanted to testify. And so the judge cleared out the jury and wanted to find out what was going on and asked Zuberi what had changed his mind. And Zuberi said he was pressured or persuaded by the defense lawyers not to testify, but now he wanted to. And the judge asked him, well, what would you talk about? And he said he would talk about the two women's testimony and provide his side of the story and tell the jurors more about his life. So at that point, one of the prosecutors, they said they wouldn't take a position on that. And they said the judge had, based on case law they presented, that a judge could allow it, but there were 5 factors the court had to consider. Among those were the reasonableness and the timeliness of the defendant's request. And so the judge took a 5-minute break, came back onto the bench and said it was too late, that allowing Zuberi to testify now would require a rebuttal from the government. They might have to call additional witnesses. They already presented their closing. They'd have to present a new closing argument. And he thought it was a ploy by Zuberi to try to bring up a reason for appeal. So he rejected it, and the defense gave their closing.
So the jury went out on a Friday afternoon, and what happened then?
The jury got the case around 12:30 on Friday afternoon. They were given lunch, and they stayed for about 3.5 hours, just under 4 hours, and issued their verdict about 4:30.
So they found him guilty in both of the cases involving both the Seattle woman and the Klamath Falls woman, and then some other charges relating to firearms and
Yes, they found him guilty on all the charges. It was 2 counts of kidnapping. It was transporting someone across state lines for the purpose of criminal sexual activity, and being a felon in possession of firearms and ammunition.
Gotcha. Well, Max, I'm going to put all the links to all of your stories in the story notes for this episode. And you've covered a lot of crime stories in your career, but this one had a lot of twists and turns, and it's almost like it's straight out of a movie, but unfortunately all too real for those victims.
Yeah, it was harrowing testimony. One of the veteran law enforcement officers who testified said he was stunned when he saw this cinder block cell. He hadn't seen anything like that in his years of covering major crimes. So, yeah, it was remarkable.
Amazing she was able to escape from that. Just really amazing. And with that, we'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Tell a friend, help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.